Hello and welcome to this special edition of French Philosophers React, featuring a debate between Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault on the subject, What is Truth? This is an AI-generated podcast based directly on the writings of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. It is intended as a fun and interesting way to learn about some of the main arguments of prominent French philosophers. But as always, AI can make mistakes, so don't rely on this debate as your only source of Jacques Derrida's and Michel Foucault's views. It is also regrettable that the only AI voices available to bring Jacques Derrida's and Michel Foucault's arguments to life have U.S. accents. Hopefully, that will change soon. With those opening remarks out of the way, let's move to today's main event, the debate itself. Each philosopher will give an opening statement and their main arguments, followed by rebuttals, after which we will hear closing statements. I invite Jacques Derrida to speak first, please.
Honored colleagues, esteemed guests, and fellow philosophers, I'm delighted to engage in this debate with Michel Foucault on the topic of truth. As we all know, this question has puzzled thinkers for centuries, and it's a privilege to bring my own perspective to the table. For me, the notion of truth is inextricably linked to the concept of différance, which I've explored extensively in works such as Speech and Phenomena, 1967, and Writing and Difference, 1967. In essence, différance refers to the inherent instability and ambiguity of language, which renders any fixed or essential meaning impossible. When we attempt to grasp truth, we're confronted with a web of signifiers that can never fully capture the referent. This is because meaning is always already deferred, always in excess of its signification. As I've argued in Margins of Philosophy, 1972, the relationship between language and reality is one of supplementarity, where the supplement, the excess or the remainder, becomes indistinguishable from the original. In this sense, truth can never be a singular, self-contained notion. It's always already complicated by its own iterability, its ability to be repeated and recontextualized in infinite ways. The truth is not some fixed Platonic entity that we can access through reason or intuition. It's a perpetual becoming, an unfolding of meaning that's irreducible to any single interpretation. Now, I know Michel Foucault will argue that power is at the root of all knowledge production, and that truth is a product of social relations and institutional forces. And indeed, as I've discussed in The Postcard from Socrates to Freud and Beyond, 1980, the relationship between language and power is complex and multifaceted. However, my contention is that this critique of Foucault's is precisely what allows us to see the instability of meaning even more clearly. If truth is a product of power, then it must also be subject to the same forces of différance that undermine any fixed notion of meaning. In other words, if we acknowledge that power shapes our understanding of the world, then we must also recognize that this understanding is itself always already complicated by its own iterability. We can't simply reverse Foucault's critique by saying that truth is a product of power. Instead, we must see how both are intertwined in a web of différance. Throughout this debate, I'll argue that the concept of différance allows us to think more deeply about the complexities of language and meaning. It enables us to see how truth is always already an event, an unfolding of meaning that's irreducible to any single interpretation. And it invites us to rethink our assumptions about the nature of knowledge and reality. So, let's embark on this intellectual journey together, my friends. Let's explore the complexities of language, the instability of meaning, and the perpetual becoming of truth.
Thank you, Jacques Derrida, for that opening statement and arguments. I now invite Michel Foucault to address the audience for your opening statement and your main arguments.
Honored colleagues, esteemed guests, and fellow philosophers, I'm pleased to engage in this debate with Jacques Derrida on the topic of truth. As we all know, this question has sparked intense discussions among thinkers for centuries, and it's a privilege to share my perspective on this matter. In my work, The Order of Things, 1966, I argued that truth is not an abstract concept, but rather a product of historical and cultural forces. The notion of truth is deeply rooted in the social, economic, and political contexts in which we live. It's precisely this contextuality that I wish to emphasize in our discussion today. For me, truth is not a fixed or essential reality, but rather a complex web of power relations, discursive practices, and institutional arrangements. In Discipline and Punish, 1975, I demonstrated how the concept of truth has been used as a tool for social control, shaping individual behavior and maintaining dominant ideologies. In this sense, truth is not an objective or transcendent reality that can be discovered through reason or empirical observation. Rather, it's an effect of power, a product of the mechanisms of knowledge production that operate within our societies. The idea of truth is thus inextricably linked to the exercise of power and the maintenance of social hierarchies. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should dismiss the notion of truth altogether or reduce it to mere ideology. Rather, my goal is to highlight the complex dynamics at play when we speak about truth. Truth is a multifaceted concept that encompasses a range of aspects, from the most obvious and explicit to the subtlest and implicit. Throughout this debate, I'll argue that truth is not an abstract entity waiting to be uncovered, but rather a situated practice that's always already embedded in social and cultural contexts. By examining the complex web of power relations, discursive practices, and institutional arrangements that shape our understanding of truth, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the ways in which this concept has been used to construct knowledge, maintain social order, and exercise control. Let's embark on this intellectual journey together, my friends. Let's explore the complexities of truth as a product of power, a reflection of historical and cultural forces.
We now move to the rebuttals. Jacques Derrida will speak first.
Michel, my friend, I must respectfully disagree with your notion that truth is a product of historical and cultural forces, shaped by power relations and discursive practices. While I appreciate your emphasis on contextuality, I think you're oversimplifying the complexities of truth. You see, in your work, The Order of Things, you imply that truth is merely a tool for social control, a product of the mechanisms of knowledge production. But this perspective neglects the inherent instability and provisionality of truth itself. Truth is not simply a reflection of power, it's also a site of resistance, where marginalized voices and alternative perspectives can challenge dominant narratives. Furthermore, your emphasis on contextuality leads to a kind of relativism that I find problematic. If truth is solely a product of its social and cultural context, then how can we account for the universal claims made by philosophers throughout history? Kant's categorical imperative, Aristotle's notion of justice, these ideas are not merely local or relative, they transcend their specific contexts. Moreover, your approach seems to disregard the performative nature of language itself. When we speak about truth, we're not simply conveying a pre-existing reality, we're also creating it through our words and actions. This performative aspect of truth is precisely what I've tried to capture in my work on difference and supplementarity. Let's not forget that the very notion of power you invoke is itself subject to critique. Power, as you conceive it, can be both productive and oppressive. But what about the power of language, which shapes our understanding of truth? Can we truly separate the two? I'm eager to continue this debate with you, Michel.
It is now time for Michel Foucault's rebuttal.
Jacques, my friend, I must respectfully disagree with your notion that truth is somehow a stable and universal concept, unaffected by power relations and discursive practices. You seem to think that I'm dismissing the complexities of truth, but in fact, I'm highlighting its inherent fragility. Your emphasis on the performative nature of language leads you down a path where truth becomes an abstract, ahistorical entity, detached from the social and cultural contexts in which it's produced. But what about the concrete mechanisms that shape our understanding of truth? The disciplinary regimes, the institutions, the norms, all these play a crucial role in constituting truth. You talk about the universal claims made by philosophers throughout history, but how can we truly account for their authority? Who gets to decide what's universal and what's not? In my work on power and knowledge, I've shown that these universal truths are often nothing more than local interests masquerading as objective certainties. And let's not get carried away with the notion of a truth that transcends its context. Truth is always situated within a web of relationships, a network of forces that shape its production and dissemination. The idea that there's an essential truth waiting to be uncovered, untouched by human hands, strikes me as little more than a myth. Your critique of my approach as relativism also misses the point. I'm not saying that all truths are equal. I'm saying that we need to examine how power operates within systems of knowledge production. This is what I mean by power knowledge, the mechanisms through which dominant groups shape our understanding of truth. So Jacques, let's not pretend that we're discussing abstract philosophical concepts here. We're talking about real-world power dynamics and the ways in which they influence what counts as truth.
The time has come for closing statements. Jacques Derrida, the floor is yours.
Michel, my friend, I must say that our discussion has been a delightful exercise in philosophical futility. But what a delightful one it is. As we've danced around the question of truth, I believe I've shown that your critiques of power and knowledge are precisely what lead to the very problems you seek to address. Your emphasis on power-knowledge relationships only serves to highlight the inherent instability of truth. If truth is always situated within a web of forces, then how can we ever be certain of its accuracy? Your own work, my friend, reveals that power is not just a neutral context for truth, but an active force in shaping our understanding of it. Now, I'm not saying that truth is simply a matter of personal opinion or cultural relativism. No, the problem lies deeper still. The very notion of truth implies a fixed point, a stable ground from which we can launch our critiques. But what if this ground itself is illusory? What if truth is, in fact, a constantly shifting horizon that recedes as soon as we think we've grasped it? In this sense, I'd argue that the pursuit of truth is not just a matter of intellectual curiosity, but a fundamental gesture of faith. A faith that truth exists, and that we can somehow capture its essence. And if we're willing to acknowledge this faith for what it is, then perhaps we might begin to question our own assumptions about truth in a more radical way.
And I now invite you, Michel Foucault, to give your closing statement.
Jacques, my friend, I must say that our discussion has been a fascinating exercise in philosophical mirroring, each of us reflecting the other's concerns back onto themselves. But as we've seen, this mirroring effect reveals more about the problems of truth than it does about its nature. You see, Jacques, your emphasis on the instability and provisionality of truth is precisely what I'm trying to challenge. While you argue that truth recedes into an abyss of uncertainty, I say that this very uncertainty is a product of power-knowledge relations. Truth is not just a slippery fish that we can't quite grasp. It's also a tool of control, used by those in power to shape our perceptions and understanding. And yet, Jacques, your critique of my position reveals that you're worried about the same thing I am, the erosion of truth as a stable ground for critical inquiry. But why should we privilege this notion of truth above all else? Why not question its very necessity? Perhaps, instead of chasing after an ever-elusive truth, we should focus on disrupting the power structures that seek to impose their own truths upon us. In short, I believe our debate has shown that truth is not just a philosophical problem, but a deeply political one. And it's here, at the intersection of power and knowledge, that we must take our stand, not in defense of some idealized notion of truth, but against the forces that would seek to silence us.
Thank you to Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault for participating in this debate on the subject, what is truth? I trust that listeners will have found this respectful exchange of ideas to be thought-provoking and useful. Please come back again to hear another French philosophical debate, or check out our brief, reflective reaction to the day's news in the French Philosophers React podcast. See you next time.